when 65-year-old Ray Dawson, a quiet janitor at Silver Crest Equestrian Center, was dared to ride Midnight, a wild Mustang that had already maimed 3 trainers. No one took him seriously. With a bet on the line, Ray accepted the challenge. But what happened next wasn't just a tame horse. It was a transformation that would change everything, revealing secrets, bonds, and a past that no one saw coming. Ray Dawson had always been a man of few words. His days at Silver Crest Equestrian Center were spent quietly moving between stables, broom in hand, his back bent with years of labor. But today, as he swept the sawdust from the aisle, he overheard something that made his spine straighten. "That Mustang's a menace," Marcus Reeves, the head trainer, said with a scoff. "No one's gonna touch him, let alone tame him." Ray glanced toward the isolation paddock, where Midnight, the wild Mustang, paced restlessly. His black coat shimmered in the afternoon sun, but his eyes, wild, untrusting, spoke of nothing but defiance. He was a creature born for freedom, not for the confines of a stable, and he had proven that at the cost of 3 professional trainers. The animal was a force of nature, untamable by conventional means. Alexander Whitfield, the wealthy rancher who owned Silver Crest, stood tall at the end of the aisle, his polished boots clicking against the cobblestones as he watched the Mustang. He was a man who had built his empire on controlling the uncontrollable, shaping raw ambition into polished success. And yet, here he was, confronted with an animal that refused to be dominated. "He's too dangerous, Mr. Whitfield," Marcus said, shaking his head. "We need to put him down before he hurts someone else." "Nonsense," Whitfield replied, his voice cool and dismissive. "Every horse can be broken." Ray caught the words just as they left Whitfield's lips, his broom slowing in his hands. The rich man's certainty grated against the air. He knew horses, he knew their fears, their instincts, their rhythms. The problem wasn't the horse. The problem was the approach. "You think that Mustang can be tamed, Dawson?" Whitfield's voice was suddenly sharp, aimed directly at him. Ray had been so intent on the horse that he hadn't noticed the eyes now fixed on him. "You've worked around horses. What's your take?" For a long moment, Ray remained silent, his hands gripping the broom handle, the weight of their gaze pressing down on him. He felt their eyes, skeptical, dismissive, scrutinizing his every move. The janitor, the man who cleaned stables and emptied buckets, what could he possibly know about training horses? "I haven't seen him myself, sir," Ray said quietly, his gravelly voice betraying no emotion. Whitfield's lips twisted into a smirk, amusement flickering in his eyes. "Well, take a look. Let's see what you think after you've spent some time with him." Ray hesitated, his instincts telling him to refuse, to remain in the shadows where he belonged. But then Whitfield's challenge landed like a stone in his chest. "Let me make it interesting," Whitfield continued. "You have 1 month. Tame him. No tricks. Just make him rideable. $5,000 says you can't do it." The words hung in the air. Marcus and the others snickered behind his back, but Ray didn't flinch. He knew the stakes. If he failed, his quiet life at Silver Crest would be over. But if he succeeded, he wasn't sure what would come next. Ray set his broom down with deliberate care, his gaze flicking to Midnight, who had stopped pacing to stare at him from across the paddock. There was something in the horse's eyes, a flicker of recognition maybe, or a challenge. Ray could almost hear the Mustang's quiet question, "Are you brave enough to try?" "I'll do it," Ray said finally, his voice steady. He didn't need the money, but the stakes were clear. This was more than a bet. It was about proving something to himself and to the world that had never seen him for who he truly was. Alexander's smile widened, pleased by the unexpected answer. "Good. We'll see what you're made of, Dawson. And so, with the bet made, and his fate uncertain, Ray turned away from the stables and made his way toward the paddock, where Midnight waited, untamed, unbroken, and now his challenge to conquer. Ray stood at the edge of the paddock, watching Midnight for the first time. The Mustang's dark coat gleamed like the midnight sky, rippling with muscle beneath his sleek, tense frame. His eyes, however, were wild-wide, frantic, filled with a raw, untamed energy that seemed to crackle in the air around him. The horse paced restlessly, head held high, nostrils flaring, his every movement sharp with fear. The trainers and handlers had long since given up trying to tame him. Midnight had already left 3 of them nursing injuries that ranged from bruised egos to fractured bones. They spoke of him as if he were something beyond a horse, a beast, a monster too far gone to be saved. Ray had seen it all before, not with horses like Midnight, but with men who were broken, not by nature, but by the circumstances that had shaped them. People who wore their fear like armor, pushing others away before they could be hurt again. Midnight was no different, and Ray could see that. The others stood at a distance, whispering among themselves, their eyes flicking nervously to the horse. Some said he was impossible to train, others thought he should be put down. But Ray saw something in those wild eyes, a flicker of recognition, a quiet cry for help. He stepped forward, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. The horse's ears flicked toward him, but Midnight didn't retreat. Instead he held his ground, eyes narrowing with suspicion. The air between them was thick with tension, but Ray didn't move any closer. He didn't need to. Ray stood there, watching Midnight for a long time, his weathered face impassive. There was no fear in his eyes, just understanding. Midnight wasn't a killer. He wasn't a beast. He was a creature in pain, trapped in a world he didn't understand, surrounded by people who only knew how to break him further. The Mustang snorted, pawing at the dirt, but Ray didn't flinch. He simply watched, his presence a quiet force that seemed to calm the air around them. The horse was still, but his muscles trembled with the tension of a creature unsure whether to run or fight. Ray knew that feeling all too well. After what felt like an eternity, Midnight took a slow step toward him. His eyes remained fixed on Ray, but there was something different in them now. Less wild, less frantic, just curiosity. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Ray didn't smile. There was no need. He didn't need Midnight's trust yet. He just needed the horse to know one thing, that he wasn't like the others. He wouldn't force anything. He would be patient, and in time, Midnight would come to see that. Ray turned and walked away, not looking back. The challenge had only just begun, but he had a feeling deep in his gut that this was going to be more than just a bet. This was about something much bigger than either of them. The morning air was cool as Ray returned to the paddock, the faint light of dawn casting long shadows across the dusty ground. Midnight was already there, pacing again, his black coat nearly blending into the growing shadows. The Mustang's head was held high, eyes darting toward the fences, the stables, the distant figures of the stable hands. He was still, but never at rest, watchful, tense, as if waiting for something to happen, something he couldn't quite predict. Ray approached slowly, his boots steady against the gravel, his pace deliberate but unhurried. His hands were empty, no ropes, no tools, nothing to give the horse the excuse to see him as a threat. There were no illusions of control, no need to assert dominance. He had learned long ago that true strength wasn't in power, it was in patience, in quiet presence, and that was all he had to offer this Mustang. Midnight's head snapped up the moment Ray entered the paddock, eyes wide with uncertainty. The horse froze, nostrils flaring, his muscles rippling beneath his sleek coat. The tension in the air thickened, but Ray didn't stop. He kept walking, his movements calm and unhurried, offering no sudden gestures, no threatening intentions. The Mustang didn't move, but his eyes tracked Ray with every step, calculating, unsure. Ray halted just a few feet away from the horse, close enough to be noticed, but far enough to give Midnight the space he needed. His heart didn't race. He wasn't afraid. Fear had no place in this moment. He spoke softly, his voice low, more a murmur than a command. "You're not a monster," Ray said, his words falling into the quiet between them. "Just a horse. And I'm just a man. No one's gonna hurt you." Midnight's ears flicked forward at the sound of his voice, his gaze never wavering. There was a slight shift in the air, a momentary hesitation in the Mustang's body language. It was small, barely noticeable, but Ray caught it. Midnight was listening, not just to the words, but to the tone, to the honesty in the silence between the words. He was still wary, but there was no aggression in his stance, no desire to run, only curiosity. Ray took another slow step forward, keeping his eyes on the horse, never reaching out, never forcing anything. He stopped when he was within arm's reach, the space between them still a small but meaningful distance. The Mustang's eyes flicked down to the ground briefly, then back to Ray's face. His nostrils flared as he exhaled, a soft, tentative sound that might have been a sigh, or the closest thing to a question. Ray didn't answer it, not with words. He simply stood there, watching. Time passed, moments stretching between them, but in the stillness, Ray felt something stir, a shift, a fragile understanding. Ray didn't need to touch him, not yet. The horse wasn't ready, but for the first time, Midnight wasn't completely alone in his fear. Ray's presence was quiet, steady, a silent promise that nothing would be forced. And in that silence, the Mustang seemed to soften, just a little, as though he'd realized that not all humans were threats. Some were here to help, not to break. Ray took a deep breath, offering Midnight one final look before he turned and walked away. He knew the journey would be long, but today, for the first time, Midnight had chosen not to flee. That was enough. Ray's routine with Midnight didn't change much from day to day. He arrived at dawn, just as the first light broke over the horizon, and he left only when the last light of day faded from the sky. But to the trainers and stable hands at Silvercrest, what Ray did between those hours seemed nothing short of absurd. At first, they assumed he was simply wasting his time. How could sitting quietly with a wild Mustang, reading a book aloud, and strumming a guitar possibly make a difference? They watched from a distance, muttering among themselves, skeptical of the old janitor's methods. He didn't use ropes. No halters, no whips, no lunge lines. The Mustang, wild and aggressive, wasn't pushed or prodded into submission. Instead, Ray offered something the horse had never known: patience. He came every day with no agenda, but to simply be there, to show Midnight that not all humans were threats. And at first, Midnight resisted. He paced the paddock, his eyes watchful, his every movement quick and defensive. The moment Ray stepped inside the enclosure, Midnight would freeze, muscles tense, nostrils flaring. It was as if the Mustang was waiting for the inevitable attempt to dominate, to control. But Ray never made a move. He just stood still, his presence quiet and calm, offering no challenge. Then, over the next few days, something unusual began to happen. Ray started reading aloud to Midnight, his deep voice filling the space between them, soft and steady. He read from the same worn paperback every day, a Louis L'Amour Western that had been passed down through generations in his family. The words, though familiar to him, felt strange in the silence of the paddock. And yet, the more Ray read, the more Midnight's movements slowed. He no longer paced, he no longer watched in panic. He simply stood, his head tilted slightly, ears pricked forward as though listening. The whispers from the stable hands became louder. Some rolled their eyes, shaking their heads. "He's just wasting time," they muttered. You can't read a horse into submission. But despite their words, they couldn't stop watching. There was something about the way Ray seemed to connect with Midnight that drew them in. Even Marcus, who had always prided himself on traditional training methods, couldn't help but pause when he passed by the paddock. Ray wasn't forcing anything. He was offering space, giving the Mustang the freedom to choose to come closer, to listen, to trust. On the fifth day, Ray brought something else with him, his old guitar. It was worn, its strings dull, but the sound it produced was pure and comforting. He sat on the bucket outside the paddock. The guitar cradled in his hands and began to play. The melody was simple, just a few chords strummed over and over again. Midnight, who had been pacing the far corner, froze. His ears flicked back and forth, tracking the sounds. The trainers and stable hands watched in silence, some shaking their heads, others just listening. They didn't understand. They didn't have to. Ray wasn't trying to tame Midnight with force. He was simply giving him something the others never had: respect, time, and the freedom to come to him when he was ready. And every day, Ray's quiet methods began to change, not just the Mustang, but the way others saw him. Ray's routine with Midnight grew more familiar with each passing day. He arrived each morning at the same time, his boots leaving quiet imprints in the soft earth of the paddock, and each time Midnight would be there, pacing, alert, watchful. But something had changed. The Mustang's movements were no longer as frantic. His eyes, still wary, now held a quiet curiosity, flicking to Ray with less suspicion and more, something else, less aggression, more thought. The first time Midnight allowed Ray to step closer, the distance between them shrinking just a little. Ray didn't move. He simply stood still, watching, waiting. The Mustang's dark eyes studied him, flickering from his hands to his face, as if trying to understand this man who had become part of his world without demanding anything in return. Ray didn't reach out. He didn't try to touch him. He just let Midnight make the choice. It was small, that first step, the faintest lowering of the Mustang's head, the slight softening of his posture. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was a willingness to allow Ray into his space without the immediate threat of flight. That was something. The days continued, and with them, so did Ray's steady, silent presence. He read his book, played his guitar, and sometimes just sat in silence, letting the Mustang come to him in his own time. The horse began to seek him out more frequently, stepping closer during Ray's visits. Ray never moved fast, never spoke sharply. He just let the horse make his choices, giving him the space to grow, to decide, and to trust. But as Midnight's trust grew, so did the weight of Ray's past. Every time he saw the horse's progress, every time the Mustang's wary eyes softened, Ray felt a quiet ache stir in his chest. It wasn't just Midnight who had been broken. Ray had once been the same, cautious, distrustful, unwilling to let anyone get close. And though he hadn't noticed it before, as he worked with Midnight, he saw the reflection of his own wounds in the horse's eyes. The Mustang wasn't the only one learning to trust. Every quiet moment between them seemed to peel back layers of Ray's own history, his grief, his mistakes, and the loss he had carried with him for so long. Midnight's quiet progress stirred memories Ray had long buried. The death of his daughter, Emma, the way she had looked at him that day, so eager to learn, so full of hope, and then the accident, the way she had fallen, and the way Ray had failed her. But as Midnight began to relax in his presence, Ray realized something he hadn't before. He had never fully healed. The weight of his past had stayed with him, hidden beneath his quiet life. Yet now, as Midnight learned to trust, so did Ray. He was starting to forgive himself, just as the Mustang was beginning to forgive the world. Every day, they moved a little closer, both in body and spirit. And Ray knew, deep down, that the real work wasn't just teaching Midnight to trust, it was learning to trust himself again. Sarah Cooper had always been a practical woman. She worked with horses every day, tending to their needs, brushing their coats, and making sure they were ready for their next ride. She had seen it all, the stubborn ones, the aggressive ones, the ones that needed a firm hand and a quick lesson. When it came to training, there was a right way, and there was a wrong way, and the right way, in Sarah's mind, was always through structure, discipline, and respect for the animal's limits. She had watched Ray from the moment he first began his routine with Midnight, her curiosity piqued by his odd methods. She had no problem with the man, but she couldn't quite understand how he thought he could tame a wild Mustang without the proper tools. No ropes, no halters, just books, soft music, and time spent quietly in the paddock. It seemed like nothing more than a waste of time, a fool's errand. But something had started to change. She didn't notice it at first, not in the way Midnight's posture had softened or the way the horse's pace had slowed. It was more subtle, a kind of shift in the air between Ray and the Mustang. The tension, once so thick and oppressive, had lessened. Midnight no longer attacked the fences in panic at Ray's approach. He still stood at the far end of the paddock, eyes alert, but when Ray entered, he didn't retreat. He simply watched. It was the second week when Sarah found herself lingering at the edge of the paddock, her hands on the fence, watching the quiet exchange between man and horse. Ray was sitting on his overturned bucket, guitar in hand, and Midnight was closer than he had ever been before, his black coat gleaming under the soft light of dusk. The Mustang's head was lowered slightly, his eyes soft but wary, as he listened to the faint melodic chords. Sarah had always known horses could learn through repetition and consistency, but what Ray was doing seemed like something different. The Mustang, despite all his wildness, was starting to respond. He wasn't being forced into submission, he was being given space to exist, to choose, and as Sarah watched, something inside her shifted. She had never considered training from this perspective, an approach built on trust rather than domination. Later that evening, when Ray was finished for the day and Midnight was grazing quietly in the paddock, Sarah approached him, a hesitant smile tugging at her lips. She had never spoken to him much beyond the occasional greeting, but today she felt a pull toward him. She was curious, and maybe just a little bit moved by what she had seen. "Ray," she called softly, her voice a little uncertain. He turned, his face impassive, as usual, but his eyes held a warmth that made her feel welcome. "You're doing something different with him," Sarah said, gesturing to the Mustang. "It's working, isn't it?" Ray didn't answer immediately. He just looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing her words. Finally, he nodded. "It's not about forcing him, Sarah. It's about letting him decide. We've both got to learn to trust." She didn't fully understand it, but she could see the truth in his words. Midnight, the wild, untamable Mustang, was changing, and somehow Ray was the one who had helped him do it. As she walked away, Sarah's mind was buzzing with thoughts. She had always trusted the methods of the real trainers, the ones who worked with control and force. But now, as she watched Ray and Midnight, she wondered if there was another way. And if Ray could succeed, maybe she had more to learn than she realized. Ray didn't expect to see Victor Ramirez again, not after all these years, not after everything that had happened. But there he was, standing just outside the paddock, his tall frame silhouetted against the afternoon sun. Victor's presence cut through the quiet like a sharp breeze, stirring up memories Ray had tried so hard to bury. He hadn't expected the man to still be around, much less find him standing on the grounds of Silver Crest. Victor had been one of Ray's closest colleagues back in the day, a brilliant trainer with a knack for reading horses like no one else. They had been a formidable team, traveling from clinic to clinic, sharing their knowledge and their methods with eager young trainers. It had been a time when Ray had been on top of the world, before everything had come crashing down. Ray had been just a few steps away from Midnight's paddock when he saw Victor for the first time in over a decade. The other man was standing by the gate, watching Midnight with an appreciative eye. His weathered face seemed unchanged, though the years had etched deeper lines into his features. The years had also softened the sharpness in Victor's gaze. But when their eyes met, Ray felt that familiar jolt, a connection that had never really faded. "Ray," Victor called, his voice low but steady. "Didn't expect to find you here." Ray said nothing at first but nodded. The silence between them was thick with years of unspoken words. It had been too long since they had shared a drink after a long day of training, or exchanged quiet thoughts on horses. Ray had distanced himself from that world, had run from it ever since that day. But Victor wasn't the kind of man to let the past go unacknowledged. "I see you're working with Midnight," Victor said, glancing back at the Mustang, who had stopped pacing to watch them. "Interesting approach." Ray glanced toward the horse. Midnight stood still, his black coat gleaming, ears flicking as though sensing the weight of the conversation. Ray felt a shift in the air, a pull from the past, and he knew exactly where this was going. He didn't want to go there, not again, but Victor, as always, was relentless. "You're still doing it," Victor said, his voice softer now. "The way you always did. You never were one for the standard methods." Ray clenched his jaw. He knew where this was leading. He could feel it creeping into the space between them, like smoke wafting through the air. "I've had a lot of time to think about it," Ray muttered, his voice low. He didn't want to say it. Didn't want to drag up the memories that had left him hollow inside. "Maybe that's what I've been doing wrong." Victor didn't push. Instead, he stepped closer, his eyes narrowing with a knowing look. "It wasn't your fault, Ray," he said, his voice a little rough. "The accident with Emma, you did everything you could." Ray flinched, the name hitting him like a blow to the chest. His hand tightened on the fence, the memory of his daughter's eager smile rushing back. She had been so full of promise, so full of life, and then in a single moment, she was gone. It hadn't been the horse. Not really. It had been something out of their control. But Ray couldn't shake the feeling that he had failed her. "I couldn't save her," Ray said quietly, the words raw in his throat. "I couldn't protect her." Victor's gaze softened. "You couldn't have known, Ray. She was meant for great things, and you helped her get there. But this," he gestured to Midnight, "this is where you belong, not hiding in the shadows." The pain in Ray's chest twisted, but he didn't look away. Victor was right. He had hidden for too long. And maybe, just maybe, Midnight had brought him back into the light. Ray's heart sank when he saw Marcus standing at the gate of the paddock, his usual smug expression in place. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the dirt, but the warmth in Ray's chest began to fade. He had felt a shift with midnight, a quiet progress that hadn't been visible to anyone else, but it was there. The Mustang had started to approach him more willingly, even nuzzling his hand once or twice. But now, with Marcus here, Ray knew that progress was fragile. Marcus didn't make a sound as he watched the Mustang from across the fence. He was waiting for a reaction, a flicker of resistance from midnight, something he could use to prove his own methods were superior. Ray knew what was coming. It always did. Marcus had never believed in Ray's approach. Too gentle, too patient for someone who believed in force and dominance. "Morning, Dawson," Marcus finally spoke, his voice dripping with false politeness. "I see your little project is making some progress. A miracle, really, that you've gotten this far." Ray didn't respond. He didn't need to. Marcus was always like this, ruthless, looking for weakness. He kept his eyes on Midnight, who stood at the far side of the paddock, cautiously eyeing Marcus's presence. Ray's quiet method had worked. Midnight had grown accustomed to his presence, trusting him more each day. But now, with Marcus here, Ray's patience was about to be tested in ways he hadn't expected. Marcus stepped into the paddock, his boots scraping the dirt loudly, intentionally making himself known. "Let's see how well your method holds up when we push him a little harder, shall we?" He reached for a long rope, his hands swift and confident. Ray's heart pounded in his chest. He knew what this meant. Marcus was going to force Midnight. He wasn't giving him space to trust. He wasn't allowing the horse to come to him. He was going to dominate, to break. "No," Ray said quietly, but his voice held a firmness that he hadn't known was still inside him. "That's not what he needs." Marcus didn't hesitate. "He's not your pet, Dawson. He's a wild animal, and if you don't show him who's in charge, he'll take advantage of you." Ray's hands tightened into fists, but he didn't move. He couldn't. Midnight was watching, and Ray couldn't let the horse see him waver now. Marcus approached Midnight, with the rope, clicking his tongue to get the horse's attention. The Mustang tensed, his muscles rippling, his eyes wide with alarm. Ray watched, helpless, as Marcus moved in quickly, pulling the rope tight around Midnight's neck. The horse reared, his body shaking with fear. Ray's breath hitched as Midnight tried to break free, his powerful body thrashing against the ropes. In an instant, all the progress they had made seemed to shatter. Midnight was wild again, his trust broken by the forceful hands of a man who believed strength came from domination, not understanding. "Stop!" Ray's voice cracked through the air, but Marcus only tightened his grip, dragging Midnight around the paddock, as if the horse were just another piece of equipment. By the time Marcus stepped back, the damage was done. Midnight was once again cornered by fear. His wild eyes met Ray's, but there was no recognition, no trust, only the same terror that had been there at the start. Ray swallowed hard, the weight of the setback settling deep in his chest. The Mustang's body was still, but his eyes were frantic, darting everywhere except to Ray. It was as if everything they had worked for had been erased in an instant. Ray approached cautiously, his voice low. "It's okay, Midnight. We'll get through this." But even as he spoke, he wasn't sure anymore. The trust they had built, the slow, quiet moments of connection, it had all been torn apart. And now, Ray had to find the strength to rebuild it. Again, Ellie Whitfield had always been a quiet presence at Silvercrest. Unlike her grandfather, Alexander, whose voice commanded attention with every word, Ellie moved through the stables with a calm grace. Her attention often focused more on the horses than on the people around her. Ray had noticed her on more than one occasion, but he had never paid her much mind. She was, after all, just a girl in the midst of a world full of trainers, riders and ranch hands. But today, as she approached the paddock, Ray couldn't ignore her. "Mr. Dawson," Ellie called softly, her voice carrying a quiet sincerity that caught his attention. "I was wondering if I could help you with Midnight." Ray looked at her, unsure of what to make of the offer. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate the gesture. It was just that he had learned through years of experience that too many people involved with a horse could lead to confusion, especially with a Mustang like Midnight. The animal had come so far with just Ray's steady presence, and the thought of introducing someone new to the mix unsettled him. "I don't know, Ellie," Ray said slowly, his tone more hesitant than he intended. "Midnight's progress is delicate. Too many hands in the pot can confuse him. He needs consistency." Ellie's gaze softened, her eyes full of quiet understanding. "I know," she said, stepping closer to the fence. "I've been watching you with him. You're different with him. Calm, patient. I think I can learn from you, not interfere." Ray studied her for a long moment. There was something about the way she spoke, the way she looked at Midnight, with the kind of quiet respect that most people didn't show the horse. It wasn't forceful, it wasn't demanding. She simply observed, and for a moment, Ray saw something in her that reminded him of himself when he first started, before the world had hardened him, before his heart had been bruised beyond repair. "You've got a good eye," he said finally, his voice quieter now, acknowledging something in her that he hadn't expected. "You watch him, but you don't try to control him." Ellie smiled, a small, genuine smile that made her face light up in a way that was rare for someone her age. "I think horses just need to be understood, not forced." Ray nodded slowly. It was the truth, but that didn't mean it was easy, and he still wasn't sure how to handle the idea of someone else being involved with Midnight. However, there was something about Ellie's words, the calm certainty in her voice, that made him reconsider. Maybe, just maybe, she could be an ally, not a disruption. "I'll let you observe," he said, finally relenting. "But you'll need to be still, no sudden movements, just watch. If you want to learn, you've got to let him come to you." Ellie's eyes lit up with excitement, but she nodded seriously. "I'll do exactly that." Over the next few days, Ellie kept her distance, sitting quietly by the fence, her notebook in hand, jotting down her observations. Ray didn't mind her presence anymore. He saw the way she moved, slowly, deliberately, and the way Midnight seemed to respond to her quiet energy. He'd never had the chance to teach someone else how to listen to a horse, but there was something about Ellie that made him want to share what he knew. And as the days passed, Ellie began to understand. She could see the shifts in Midnight's posture, the way his ears flicked when he was listening, the way his body softened when he wasn't in fear. Ray had never spoken much, but in Ellie's silent presence, Midnight began to trust more, drawing a little closer each day. Perhaps Ray had underestimated her. She wasn't a distraction. She was a student who, much like Midnight, needed someone to show her how to listen. The evening light streamed through the small window above Ray's apartment, casting a warm glow across the dusty floor. He sat at the rickety wooden table, his fingers brushing absent-mindedly over the edges of an old worn box that had been tucked away beneath his bed for years. The box had never moved, never been opened, but tonight something had drawn him to it. He had tried to forget, tried to bury it all, but now the memories felt too loud to ignore. Ray hesitated for a moment before lifting the lid. Inside, the remnants of his past sat in quiet disarray: photographs, faded articles, a few trophies wrapped in tissue paper. Each item, a testament to a time he had long since walked away from, each piece a relic of a life that seemed as distant as a forgotten dream. He hadn't wanted to look at them, he hadn't wanted to face what lay inside. But tonight, something urged him to see it again, to confront the reality he'd buried for so long. The first photograph he pulled out was a picture of him and Emma, smiling, arms around each other, standing next to a chestnut mare he'd trained to perfection. Emma had been so young, so full of potential, her eyes bright with hope and the promise of a future in the equestrian world. Her hands had been steady, confident, much like his own at that age. She had been everything he wanted her to be, everything he had dreamed for her. A champion. Ray set the photo down, his eyes lingering on her face, the pain creeping in again like a dull ache that never fully went away. His chest tightened as the memories surged. Emma's laughter, her excitement, the way she would ask him for advice on everything, from training techniques to life itself. She had been his world, and in one instant it had all come crashing down. The next thing he pulled from the box was an article, the headline stark and cold: "Tragic accident at Golden Vista Ranch claims young rider's life." His fingers trembled as he read the familiar words. Emma Dawson, 19, died after a fall from her horse during a training session. Investigators found no foul play, but the loss has shaken the equestrian community. It wasn't the first time he had seen it. It wasn't the first time he had read those words. But every time, it felt like a punch to the gut. It felt like a sentence. Ray's gaze drifted to the trophies, one in particular catching his eye. The engraved plate read Junior Champion of the Year, awarded to Emma after her first major win. He had been there when she had received it, beaming with pride. It had been the beginning of everything. And now, it was the last reminder of what they had lost. The past was always there, lurking just beneath the surface, never truly gone. He had tried to outrun it, tried to bury it in the silence of his janitorial work, but it was part of him. No matter how much he had changed, no matter how far he had run, he could never escape the man he had been, or the father who had failed. Ray closed the box slowly, his hands trembling. Midnight's quiet presence outside the window felt like a distant echo, a small comfort in a world full of unhealed wounds. He had thought he could leave it all behind, his career, his success, his failure. But now, looking at the things he had once treasured, he understood that he could never truly escape his past. He could only choose to live with it. Ray stood at the edge of the paddock, the early morning sun casting long golden streaks across the dirt. He had been here every day, without fail, quietly waiting for midnight to make the choice, to choose him, to trust him. And today something was different. Midnight stood still, his black coat shimmering faintly in the soft light, his head lowered slightly. The Mustang's eyes, once wide with fear, now held a look of quiet contemplation as he turned to face Ray. The tension in his body had eased, the constant wariness beginning to fade, replaced by something else. It wasn't yet trust, not fully, but it was a willingness to let Ray in, a small but powerful shift. Ray stepped forward slowly, not wanting to rush. The Mustang's gaze never left him, and for the first time, Ray saw not just the animal's fear, but the vulnerability beneath it. Midnight had always been wild, always kept at a distance, unwilling to let anyone too close. But today it was different. Today the space between them felt smaller. Ray extended his hand, palm open, his movements deliberate and slow. Midnight's eyes flicked from his hand to his face, and for a long moment there was nothing but stillness. The air was thick with quiet anticipation, and Ray's heart pounded in his chest, though he kept his breath steady, his gaze soft. And then it happened. Midnight took a step closer, his ears flicked forward, and with cautious curiosity, the Mustang sniffed Ray's outstretched hand. Ray didn't move, didn't try to reach out. He simply stood still, letting the horse make the decision. Slowly, as if testing the waters, Midnight brushed his muzzle against Ray's fingers. The touch was hesitant, but it was real. Ray's breath caught in his chest. It wasn't just a touch, it was a connection. The Mustang wasn't afraid. He wasn't pulling away. Midnight stood there, his body relaxed, his eyes softening as he let Ray's hand linger on his coat. A quiet smile tugged at the corners of Ray's lips, but he didn't speak. There was nothing to say. Words couldn't capture the magnitude of what was happening, what had been happening all along. Ray's approach had never been about force, never about breaking Midnight's spirit. It had been about waiting, about giving the horse the time and space to choose trust over fear. As if to reinforce the bond between them, Midnight nudged Ray's shoulder, a soft, tentative gesture of affection. The Mustang's breath was warm against Ray's skin, his head resting lightly against him, as though seeking comfort, seeking connection. And Ray, for the first time in a long while, let himself feel it, let himself feel the slow healing that had begun inside him, just as it had begun in Midnight. The breakthrough wasn't just Midnight's, it was Ray's too. For the first time in years, he let go of the guilt that had been his constant companion. He let go of the past, just for a moment, and allowed himself to heal. He had always believed that horses could heal people, but now he realized that sometimes it worked the other way around. Ray stood there, his hand resting gently on Midnight's neck, the weight of the moment grounding him. They were both healing, and for the first time, it felt like they were doing it together. Ray sat on the edge of the paddock, his gaze fixed on Midnight as the Mustang grazed quietly nearby. The bond between them had grown deeper with each passing day, the unspoken connection, now something he could feel in his bones. Ray had long ago given up on the idea of returning to the world he once knew, the world of high-profile competitions, the applause, the accolades. He had buried that part of himself along with the grief he had never fully healed from. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a soft glow across the quiet scene, a shadow appeared at the gate. Victor Ramirez stood there, his figure framed by the fading light. Ray's pulse quickened, though he didn't stand. He had recognized Victor the moment he saw him. There was no mistaking the way he carried himself. A man who had once been Ray's colleague, mentor, and confidant in the world of training. But that was before everything had changed. Before Ray had walked away from it all, Victor's voice broke the silence. Ray didn't respond immediately, his eyes still on Midnight. He could feel the weight of Victor's gaze, though he didn't want to meet it. "Not yet. I thought I might find you here," Victor said, stepping closer, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. "Looks like you've made some progress." Ray turned then, his face impassive, but his eyes wary. "What do you want, Victor?" Victor's gaze was steady, sharp. He had always been able to read Ray with uncanny accuracy, even when Ray wanted to hide. "I've been watching, and I think it's time you came back." Ray raised an eyebrow, disbelief flickering in his chest. "Back to what?" "To the horse world," Victor replied simply. "I've got an opportunity for you. A high-profile training program. They need someone with your expertise. Someone who knows the horses, someone who understands them the way you do." Ray's heart thudded in his chest. The words were tempting, more tempting than he cared to admit. The training program would put him back in the spotlight, back where he had once felt powerful. He would have the chance to train the best, to push his limits again, to show the world that he was still the man he once was. But then there was Midnight, standing just a few feet away, his head down, his trust now firmly rooted in Ray's hands. Ray had spent so long running from his past, hiding from his own pain, and in that time, Midnight had become something more than a challenge to conquer. The Mustang had become a companion, a reflection of Ray's own healing. He couldn't walk away from that, not yet. "I don't know, Victor," Ray said quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of the decision. "I've got something here, something real." Victor stepped closer, his expression softening slightly. "I know you've got something real, Ray. But sometimes, the realest thing you can do is live the life you're meant for. You've got a gift, one that no one else has. It's time you stopped hiding from it." The words hit Ray harder than he expected. His hand instinctively reached for Midnight's neck, feeling the warmth of the Mustang's presence, grounding him. "I'm not sure I'm ready to leave all of this," Ray said softly, his eyes on Midnight's gentle gaze. "Not yet." Victor paused, his gaze thoughtful. "You don't have to decide right now, but don't ignore the opportunity when it comes knocking. You've earned it, Ray. Don't let it slip away." Ray stood in silence as Victor turned and walked away, leaving him with the quiet murmur of the wind and the soft rustle of Midnight's mane. The choice lay heavy on his chest: go back to the life he had known, or stay in the peace he had finally found. The final days of the month had arrived, and with them came a growing tension that Ray could feel in the pit of his stomach. Midnight had come so far, the wild Mustang now showing a trust Ray had never thought possible. But as the end of the wager loomed, so did the ever-present shadow of Alexander Whitfield. The man was relentless, driven by pride, and now he was demanding results. Ray had known it was coming. The bet had always been clear: if he couldn't ride Midnight by the end of the month, his time at Silver Crest would be over. What Alexander didn't understand, what no one had understood, was that this wasn't about breaking Midnight's spirit. It wasn't about submission or dominance. It was about respect. And Ray was willing to put everything on the line to prove it. The call came early one morning, the sharp, clipped tone of Alexander's voice echoing through the phone. "Meet me at the arena. I want to see if your methods are as effective as you say." Ray knew what that meant. A final test. He would either succeed and earn the respect he had been fighting for, or he would fail, and everything he had worked for would unravel. By the time Ray arrived at the arena, a small crowd had already gathered. The air was thick with anticipation, the murmurs of the stable hands and trainers drifting on the breeze. At the far end of the arena, Midnight stood, his black coat gleaming under the harsh light, his head held high. The Mustang was still wild, still untamed in ways that no one but Ray could see, but the bond between them had grown strong. Alexander was already waiting, arms crossed, his gaze sharp and calculating. "Let's see what you've got, Dawson," he said, his tone dripping with skepticism. "I want to see you ride him. Show me that your patience has done something other than turn him into a tame pet." Ray didn't flinch. He had faced worse challenges than this, had faced people who didn't understand his way, who couldn't see the value in the quiet approach. But today, it wasn't just about proving something to Alexander. It was about proving it to himself. He approached Midnight slowly, speaking in soft tones, his hands steady as he reached out to the Mustang. Midnight's eyes met his, and for the first time in days, Ray could feel the tension in the horse's body begin to ease. There was no fear, no resistance. Midnight's trust had been built on the foundation Ray had carefully laid, day after day, through nothing more than patience and respect. Ray moved to the mounting block, his heart steady. The crowd was silent, watching intently, but he could block them out. His focus was on the Mustang, and the Mustang alone. He spoke again, low and reassuring, as he slid onto Midnight's back. The Mustang shifted beneath him, but didn't move away. For a moment Ray was still, letting Midnight find his balance. The challenge wasn't in the ride, it was in the trust. Midnight, for all his wildness, had chosen to trust Ray, and that was all that mattered. The first step forward was tentative, but it was there, a sign of willingness, of progress. Ray guided Midnight gently, his hands light on the reins, his legs relaxed against the Mustang's sides. The crowd watched, stunned into silence as Midnight moved with an ease that no one had expected. Alexander's face betrayed a flicker of disbelief. Ray hadn't broken the Mustang. He had made him see that the greatest strength wasn't in force, it was in understanding. Ray rode Midnight in a slow circle, the Mustang's movements smooth, controlled, not out of submission, but out of trust. He had done it. The wager had been won, not through brute force, but through a bond that no one else could see. As Ray dismounted, the crowd began to murmur, and Alexander's expression shifted, acknowledging the victory, though begrudgingly. Ray's future wasn't just in the balance of the wager, it was in the quiet victory of trust. And as Midnight nudged his shoulder, Ray knew that nothing could break what they had built. Ray stood in the quiet of the paddock, Midnight grazing peacefully nearby, the Mustang's glossy black coat catching the fading light of the day. The arena was empty now, the final test passed, the tension of the bet gone, replaced by an unexpected stillness. For the first time in a long while, Ray felt the weight of the past loosen, like a knot slowly untangling itself. Midnight had come through it all, had come to trust, not because he was forced, but because he had chosen to. And that, Ray knew, was the real victory. Alexander Whitfield approached from behind, his footsteps slow and deliberate, and Ray turned to meet him. The older man's face was unreadable, his arms crossed, but there was something different in his expression now, a shift, acknowledgement. Maybe. Or maybe just the quiet realization that Ray had done the impossible. "You've proven me wrong," Alexander said, his voice almost reluctant, though it carried an air of respect that had been absent before. "Midnight is more than I expected. You've done it, Dawson. You've tamed him." Ray's eyes never left Midnight. "I didn't tame him," he said softly. "I just gave him the space to trust." Alexander paused, his gaze lingering on the Mustang. "Well, whatever you call it, you've done what no one else could, and that's why I'm offering you something. A new position here, as a trainer. I'll make it official. No more sweeping floors. You've earned it." The words hung in the air, but they didn't have the weight Ray had expected. He had spent his whole life in the horse world, had built a career, gained respect, only to lose it all in a single moment. He had believed for so long that returning to that life was impossible. He had convinced himself that he was better off in the background, unseen and unimportant. But now, standing at the crossroads of this offer, it felt different. He felt different. Ray looked at Midnight, his gaze steady. "I appreciate the offer, Alexander, but I'm not sure it's the right path for me anymore." Alexander studied him, surprised by the response, and Ray could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him. He had spent so much of his life running from the past, hiding from the grief that had stolen his future. But with Midnight, he had found something he hadn't expected, healing. And it hadn't come from the spotlight or the recognition. It had come from the quiet moments with a horse that, like him, had been misunderstood, lost, and in need of patience. Ray turned to Alexander, his voice steady. "I'm not sure I want to go back to what I was. I've found something here with Midnight. Something I didn't even know I needed." Alexander's expression softened, though he didn't speak for a long while. Finally he nodded. You've earned your peace, Ray. Whatever path you choose, I respect it. As Ray walked away, the weight of the decision settled in his chest, but it felt lighter now. He wasn't just leaving behind the life he had known. He was stepping into something new, a future built on trust, patience, and a bond forged with a wild Mustang. It wasn't the path he had expected, but for the first time in years, it felt right. Ray glanced over at Midnight, who raised his head and met his eyes. The Mustang nickered softly, as if to remind Ray they were in this together, and Ray knew, without a doubt, that this was only the beginning. If Ray's journey with Midnight has touched your heart, don't forget to hit like, share this story, and subscribe for more tales of healing, trust, and unexpected transformations. Join us next time for more inspiring stories.